Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to just repeat that offer. Anyone who is unable to access early childhood education in their community is to directly contact Alfred Nardo, and he is going to establish that placement. And that's on behalf of anyone. And that means that if you are unable to do that, then I'm assuming, therefore, that there will be no deduction or penalty regime via work and income. He's holding up a business card. He's put his name to the offer. I really want to make sure other members of the House know that. Any casework, fire it straight through to Alfred in West Auckland. I look forward to doing that. Mr. Speaker, there were a lot of reports referenced by the last speaker, and he used those reports to try and demonstrate that there was not consensus around the measurement of poverty and hardship in New Zealand, and in fact internationally. He referenced the Children's Commissioner's Child Poverty Advisory Group. There was some reference of Statistics New Zealand and some talk of the United States being the only place that had a recognised and agreed measurement. That is actually incorrect. In fact, the Children's Commissioner's Expert Advisory Group were the first probably to have put to the government a solid proposal on how we can move forward and entrench poverty measures in New Zealand. They actually wrote a very draft legislative framework for us to adopt as a parliament, one which I thought was so fantastic that I grabbed it, drafted it as a bill and put it in the ballot. A real shame then that when I came down to the House the day that we did that, I asked John Key whether he would support it. He said no before I believe he even read it. So there is an established framework. There is an established way forward for us to build consensus around child poverty measures. It's just been that the government's never wanted to adopt it, if we're talking plainly. And it's such a, I think such a well researched, evidence-based set of measures that in fact the Children's Commissioner has used it as the basis of the Child Poverty Monitor, a monitor which they now frequently undertake, and which I think is so fantastic that I usually keep it within easy reach in my desk. Here we go, here's my prop, something I prepared earlier. The Children's Commissioner now on an annual basis reports against these established measures. They're established beyond New Zealand boundaries. They're being established enough that UNICEF now uses them internationally to compare where different countries stand on child poverty. New Zealand is unable to be compared fairly across those comparable countries because we haven't entrenched all of those measurements in our country. But other states have, other OECD nations absolutely have. And so what are those roughly well-established measures? I think it's really useful to talk about this because if you're going to establish policy on child hardship, which is what this bill does, we need a decent agreed evidence base, and it's continually a point of contention. And it confuses the public. So I want to really briefly just run through this. This was the Child Poverty Monitor from 2014. The first box talks about the 260,000 Kiwi kids living in poverty. That's now actually been revised. We know it's 305,000. That measure there is a relative measure based on income. It looks at how many families are living on 60% of the median income in New Zealand, 60%. And that generates that figure. And the reason it does it on that basis, in the same way that other countries does, is it assumes that income levels demonstrate what's required to have a basic existence in that country. And there are a few variations on this measure which take into account before housing costs and after housing costs, and that's useful because it demonstrates to us that actually we have a problem in New Zealand with unaffordable housing which contributes to income poverty. So that's measure number one. Measure number two talks about the number of people here, 10% of kids at the hardest end of poverty. So that's how many are in the severe end, because if you use a 60% measure, you can use a 50% one as well. 3 out of 5 children live in poverty for many years. That's your persistence measure. You measure around how long people are staying there. And this one's interesting, actually, and the government should have looked at this one, because this one tells us that actually children are living in poverty in their youngest years, usually 4 and under. And the reason for that, if you look at the evidence, is really clear. It's because it is harder for sole parents to be in additional part-time work when they have young children in caregiver roles. But that when those children start to get older, they move into work. And actually, those were the numbers that Alfred Nara was talking about. When parents can, they do. This bill mandates parents being in work from the time their child is 3. You don't need to mandate. Parents, when they are able, for the benefit of their own children, will make that choice for themselves. And the statistics that were quoted prove that. They proved that the mandatory nature was unnecessary, and all it does is remove the discretion that parents with that children at that age need. So again, a real lack of analysis there, which is disappointing. And then a measure here, 180,000 children go without the things they need. That's your deprivation, your material deprivation scorecard. Now that doesn't look at income. What it does instead is ask, I think from memory, it's 18 questions of basic needs. Can you afford to go to the doctor when you need? Do your kids share a bed? Do you have shoes, clothing, the right food? So that's trying to delve in a bit deeper into those measures of poverty. Now, taken as a whole, that gives us a really good picture. And the government's always argued, we don't want to use one measure of poverty because it doesn't tell us everything. No one's ever argued with that. We've always said, use multiple. In fact, it's the Children's Commission actually uses 5 in his proposed legislation. Use this. It's a great start. That's the consensus we need, and the Children's Commission has handed it to us on a plate. And I think we would have a better bill before this House if we had agreed to those sets of measures, because it would allow us to use a proper evidence base. Because as we've said, it's not just about income. It's not. Income matters. That $25 that this bill will deliver matters. But it won't be enough. And again, if you look at the evidence, what we know now is that because most of the needs, the really severe needs, are for children in their youngest years, and often children where there are siblings, that tells us that actually we needed a targeted payment for young kids. It needed to be more generous, and it needed to be per child. That's what some decent analysis would have told us. But instead what the government did is it went to officials and said, we've got a pocket of money, here it is, go and see what you can do with it, rather than setting out some really clear parameters about who needed that most, And that's what we did with the Best Start payment. I guess what I want to finish on, Mr. Speaker, though, is my problem overall is that we've never argued it's just been about income. It's always been about a raft of issues. But if we want to tackle child wellbeing generally, and when I say child wellbeing, I mean poverty and I mean child harm, we need a national plan that brings together those needs across income, across housing, across early childhood, across health, across social development. And when the Vulnerable Children's Action Plan came up, that's exactly what we said to the government. If you want to find one indicator, one thing that is evident in every single child wellbeing generally, that indicator, that piece of evidence will always be deprivation. It is the most consistent theme. So if you want to reduce child abuse, if you want to improve child wellbeing, start from the position of reducing inequality and getting rid of material deprivation and income inadequacy. That will make one of the biggest differences to child wellbeing overall. I'm not just saying that, the evidence tells us it's true. That's why, Mr. Chair, I'm disappointed that this bill did not use the evidence. Otherwise, we would be debating a completely different package here this afternoon.